see you peeking around the edge, Andrew. I think you've frozen.
No. Really?
Oh, I don't know.
Right, Chairman, you're now live on YouTube.
Thank you. Yes, good morning, everybody, to the first Planning Policy and Built Heritage Working Party of 2021 on today, the 18th of January. I just want to ask people if they would kindly mute when not speaking. Make sure that their mobiles and landlines are as quiet as they can possibly be. And if you are in need of leaving the meeting at any point, it is very helpful if you turn off your video link. And if you're not speaking, it's also very helpful to turn off your video link. If you wish to speak, if you could kindly use the blue hand function, that will help my colleagues in Democratic Services, Emma Denny and Linda Yarham, who are here to assist me to ensure that we conduct the meeting as smoothly as possible and that speakers are brought in the right order. So if we can turn to the agenda. Firstly, I'd just like to extend a welcome to Councillor Mancini-Boyle. I believe this is your first working party, so welcome to you. If I can just turn to item 1, apologies for absence. I understand we do have some, Emma, if I can ask you to confirm.
Yes, we have apologies from Councillor Punchard and Councillor Stockton.
Thank you very much. So Councillor Fitch-Tillett is deputising or substituting for Councillor Stockton. I believe that's
correct.
That's correct, isn't it? Thank you very much for that. Item 2, do we have any public questions? I don't believe we have.
No, none received, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Item 3, the minutes of the last meeting of the 14th of December on pages 1 to 12 of your agenda pack. Have we all had chance to read them during our Christmas break? Any questions or any comments, corrections? I'm not going to go through these page by page. No, doesn't seem that we have. So I propose the minutes. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Toy, thank you very much. All those in favour of the minutes, if you could just raise your hand on this one. Thank you very much. Unanimous, I believe. So item 4. I don't believe we have any items of urgent business. Is that the case, Emma?
No items of urgent business, Chairman.
Thank you very much. So item 5, declarations of interest. Does anybody have any pecuniary or other declarations of interest to declare at this point? I do have one. Being a parish councillor at Corpus in Saxthorpe, I was involved in the preparation of the neighbourhood plan, which is referred to in the agenda item 7, settlement boundaries for small growth villages. So if I can just make that known to the meeting. Anyone else? Any declarations? Councillor Fitch-Tillett?
I'm a resident of Overstrand, Mr. Chairman, but the proposals do not affect my house.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fitch-Tillett. I think that covers that particular item. Item 6.
I think Councillor Fisher had a declaration as well, Chairman.
Oh, I believe. Oh, sorry. Councillor Fisher?
Just to say that, of course, I'm the ward member for Wells, which is coming up on item 8.
Thank you very much. Noted. So item 6, update on matters from previous meeting. I don't think we have any matters to update. And so we move to item 7, which is the first of the 2 items we're considering today, which is the local plan draft settlement boundaries for small growth villages. And we have on the call today Mr. Mark Ashwell, who is the Planning Policy Manager, who I believe will lead us off on this one. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So you'll all be familiar with the term development boundaries and how they currently operate. I'll just do a sort of quick run through the sort of papers. So at the moment, development boundaries around our settlements operate in pretty much absolute terms. So if you're inside the development boundary of one of the selected settlements, the expectation is you will secure planning permission, subject to compliance with a lot of other policies, but there's a strong presumption you get permission if you're inside a development boundary. And if you're outside the development boundary, your site will be designated as probably countryside. And as you'll know, there's a very strong presumption that in the countryside, you don't get planning permission other than in exceptional circumstances, which include things like rare exceptions developments and conversion of buildings to residential. So the lines operate pretty much in a hard and fast, definitive sort of way. In the new local plan, once it's adopted, those lines will operate with a great deal more flexibility. So one of the policies in the emerging plan, SD3, says in terms that if you are adjacent to the boundary and your proposal represents reasonable sort of rounding off and infilling, then despite the fact that your site is outside of the boundary, you might expect to get planning permission. Again, subject to a range of caveats about sort of design and access and all the other normal things we would consider. So there is still a need in the new plan to have boundaries, but they will operate, as I say, in a slightly more flexible way than they currently do. And rather than just rely on the existing boundaries, we've taken the opportunity to do a bit of a review of where those boundaries fall, because they were last looked at way back in the 1980s when we prepared the predecessor to the current core strategy. Those boundaries were sort of walked in minute detail and they were plotted with an eye to constraining the opportunity for development growth. So way back in the 1980s, the council was in a position where actually it delivered far more housing than was necessary. So the sort of 2 cycles ago, 2 local plans ago, we had development boundaries which were very constraining and were deliberately drawn to avoid allowing for lots of development in what at the time were 78 villages. So anyway, we've done a little bit of an update of the boundaries, incorporating things like new developments. So in some of these villages, rural exception sites will have been built, other things will have changed on the ground. And we've also tried to not take such a hard and fast line in terms of excluding bits of land. So we've been a little bit more generous in the locations that we've identified as inside rather than outside of the boundary line. We've included things like sort of doctors' surgeries and school buildings and other things which clearly are part of the built up part of each of these settlements. So the next stage is, assuming you agree these boundaries that are in front of you today, is they will then go out as part of the Regulation 19 consultation. So people will be able to make representations at that stage as to whether they agree with where the line's drawn or disagree. And those representations received at that stage will be considered by the inspector examining the plan. So that's the next sort of procedural step. I'm not going to take you through all of the settlements. There's a lot of settlements and a lot of, albeit relatively minor modifications which are being made. I don't think we need to discuss the merits of each of those individual modifications, given that they're going to go out to consultation. So I'm hoping that you will largely accept the sort of methodology that we've followed, take the view that we've done a sort of pragmatic job on it, and we can move on and put these boundaries out to public consultation. One error on our behalf, hands up, I think it's a mistake, is we didn't define boundaries for 3 settlements. So you'll notice Walcott, Potter, Higham, third one escapes me, but you're going to remind me what it is in a minute. We didn't define boundaries because those 3 settlements are largely covered by flood risk or coastal erosion constraint. And we thought at the time it would be a bit perverse to draw a boundary which purports to allow for development, only for those people who wanted to promote development inside that boundary to be told that because of flood risk policies, they couldn't get permission. So we thought that would be a sort of a conflict. Having reflected on that, we think because these settlements are being earmarked for growth, not just housing growth, they're locations for other types of development, which might well comply with flood risk policies, then drawing a boundary will have a wider policy function rather than just determining whether you can get permission for housing growth or not. So we'll need to define boundaries for those 3 settlements that we've missed. We'll follow the same methodology we've followed on the others, which basically following the extent of built up development in a sensible way, and then they will go out to consultation. So I hope that's clear. I think I'll just illustrate, if I can share my screen, perhaps one of the villages which will illustrate the process that we've gone through. Now, just bear with me while I find the relevant document and get it opened up for you.
Mark, these are all the small villages, are they, that have been designated?
It's all the small growth villages, some of which did previously have boundaries around them, Pauline, in our current plan.
Yeah.
Some of them have got boundaries, some of them are new and haven't had boundaries since back in the old days, in the old Norfolk local plans. I say all of these now will have had boundaries around them, but
the third of the ones that you couldn't remember was Sea Pauling.
Yes, thank you for that. So I'm having trouble sharing my screen here, so I'm just going to draw your attention perhaps to the examples that are included in the appendix, and leave it to you to ask any questions about individual settlements if you've got any. I discourage you from focusing too much on individual settlements and the lines on the plans. As I say, these were basis for consultation, and hopefully, unless we've dropped an absolute clangor, they are pretty sensible amendments to where the boundary line forms. So I'm going
thank you, Mark. Just for the sake of completeness, and if anything, to remind people in Corpusty and Saxthorpe, I would like the equivalent settlement boundary plan from that document to be included, and presumably on inspection, the inspector would want to see it as part of the papers.
Yes, so that's an important point. So any settlement which has currently got a neighbourhood plan, or any of the settlements where there are emerging neighbourhood plans that are being prepared, where the neighbourhood plan takes the opportunity to define a boundary, and that's already happened at Corpusty and might happen in 1 or 2 other settlements in future years, then the development boundaries identified in those plans would be the policy tool that we would generally use. So we do need to make that clear. And when we publish this material, the whole document will go out to consultation. It's not in a format that I'm entirely happy with at the moment. If you've looked at it, it needs a bit more work on it. It's very clearly a working draft, but we will make sure there are plans for Corpusty in there and a clear explanation about the status of the neighbourhood plan and how the line is defined in the neighbourhood plan.
Can I just clarify how the document will be sent out for consultation, in what format, and approximately when we expect it to go out to consultation?
Right, okay, so at the moment we're working the expectation that we'll complete the remaining review of policies by the middle of this year. That's deliberately vague. I don't want to be pinned down on a precise date for consultation, but we're working sort of July, as a sort of working target to get all of the remaining policies through the working party, give us time to draft the revised documents. There's quite a lot of work involved in that, and get them out to public consultation in July. And this development boundary work will get published as a separate freestanding background paper.
Mhm.
It'll be referred to in the document itself and in the publicity. We'll probably end up publishing maybe 8 or 10 detailed background papers which provide sort of reason, justification and supporting evidence for some of the key policy approaches, which is something we did last time. You wouldn't include this level of detail in the plan itself. You know, it would be superfluous in the actual document. So it would get a freestanding background paper with reason, justification and all of the maps in it, and an explanation about how you can make comments.
Right, yeah, thank you for that. Right, can I throw it open to wider comment and questioning? Councillor Fitch-Tillett, if I can bring you in at this point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mark, just a couple of comments on the Overstrand extensions. I see you've put a line round the garden centre. My own feeling is that probably ought to be used as employment land. And if you have included that, I'm wondering why you haven't included the property immediately to the east of it, which is actually the end of any sort of development. I know it's little picky things, but you know what Overstrand are like.
Yeah, so I've resisted the temptation myself to try and draw these boundaries individually. So this is an exercise that the team have done, and they've had a methodology to follow. And what I didn't want to do is second guess every single decision that is being made. Now, I think you can make an argument either way for the garden centre. You can take the view that it's inside, you know, it's part of the built-up fabric of the village. It's there, it exists. It's not an open field. It's not agricultural land. It's part of the built-up fabric of the village. And including it within the boundary on those terms is a reasonable decision. It does mean that you are essentially indicating that that area has got a stronger policy likelihood of being redeveloped for another purpose. You know, wherever you draw that line, that is what's going to happen. That's the consequence of putting areas of land in and excluding others. If we exclude built-up land like garden centres, then we'd probably have to exclude, you know, doctor surgery, schools, village halls, other structures which are part of the sort of fabric of the village. It would be a different approach to the one we've taken. I think, Angie, the answer is to put these out to consultation and see what people's views are. I think we will get quite a lot of representations from those people who are alive to how these boundaries work and what the consequences of being inside or outside are going to make representations on the lines. And I think rather than, as I say, the working party trying to go through them all individually, what we should do is wait and see what responses we get, and then we can take a view being armed with sort of public opinion one way or the other, and that will inform our final decision. We will have the opportunity, although we will be reluctant to use it, to modify the plan between the Regulation 19 consultation and submission for examination. There is a window in there between those two stages where you can modify the plan and ask the inspector to accept those modifications in the submitted documents. So that's the stage of the process where we could look at any widespread opposition to some of these lines, modify the plan if we felt we needed to, and ask the inspector to deal with that as a modification through the examination process.
Assuming you're satisfied with that reply, Councillor Fitch-Tillett, can I move to Councillor Dixon and then to Councillor Toy, please? Councillor Dixon.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I just ask in relation to Bardesfield at page 26 and 27, I may be missing the obvious here somewhere, but we've got a map and a red line, dotted red line round the settlement boundary on page 26, and we've got another one on page 27. I'm not able to discriminate or to identify what the differences are between what I believe to be the settlement boundary that was agreed in 1998 and that which is proposed to make a changes now. So can you just enlighten me, Mark, as to where those changes are?
There may not be any, Nigel, and you probably landed on one of the settlements. So where we've got settlements where there's been very little change or no change which would justify moving the boundary, just adopted those boundaries which existed previously in the earlier versions of the plan, either the core strategy or the predecessor to the core strategy, the old North Norfolk local plan. So there are, I think in this group of settlements, there's probably 6 or 8 of them where we're not proposing any modifications at all. We're just relying on historic boundaries which already exist, because the person who did that appraisal in that settlement took the view there was no need to make any modifications. I'll make a general point. I think in some ways it's not quite so critical, obviously, about where we draw these lines, because the policy which underpins these boundaries is now far more flexible. You've now got the opportunity for development either side of the line rather than just inside the line. So people are not being seriously disadvantaged or advantaged in quite the same way as they were when the lines were black and white. So in some ways, I'm not too concerned about the precise location of the boundary on the plan. As I say, before, if you're outside, that was pretty much it. You didn't get a look in at all. Now, if you're adjacent and well related to, you can secure permission. So they operate in quite a different way. But in this case, Nigel, because whoever did the appraisal, I think it would have been Jody, looked at the old boundary and was content that it represented the extent of built form and followed a logical line and didn't require any further modifications.
So isn't it a little bit confusing to say then on the top of page 26, it is proposed to make a new settlement boundary as follows? Wouldn't it be better to say that the boundary for the future will be that which has been established in the past?
Yeah, I think terminology like retain existing boundary as formally defined will create, set people, you'll look at it in a different way. You won't then start unraveling the old boundary. You'll start from the old boundary as if it was a given. If we use the terminology correctly, people will focus just on the modifications and not try and redraw the boundary in its entirety, which would open up a whole different can of worms. So yeah, that modification, retain existing boundary, would be a good one to make.
So will that wording be modified before you go out to consultation then?
Yeah. The background document, I was happy to bring to the working party to illustrate the work that we're doing. I don't consider it to be in publishable format yet. It needs, I think, a relatively significant rewrite. There are lots of tables of figures in there which are not explained. If the public looked at that, they think, I don't understand what that's trying to say. I understand it because I've been involved in the exercise. But it needs more plain speaking justification for what we've done, and the sort of modifications you're alluding to we'll make before we publish the document.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Mark. I'm satisfied with the answer you've given anyway. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, can I, just on that subject, I think the rigidity of the existing boundaries was ably demonstrated in an application that was dealt with at the Development Committee last week on the North Walsham application. Members who are present here will remember it, where with the sort of discretion, I suppose, that the new policy will offer us, that application may well have been accepted, but under the present planning policy, we had little choice but to refuse that application. And we've also got an appeal ongoing, the decision for which is expected shortly at Beresford Road, where the planning inspector will look at exactly this issue, an outbreak development on the edge of a settlement boundary. So we will certainly get some feedback as regards whether this policy is the one to adopt in that decision, hopefully. If I can move to Councillor Toy, I think you're next, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mark, it's just a process question, if you would please. The three areas and Saxthorpe and Corpusty that you said need to be drawn up and then go for consultation. Will that still come to this working group before it goes out, or is there a process here where we can recommend that now? The only reason I'm asking is because of the timescales, where you're being pushed obviously for timescales, and you're saying the middle of the year, and we want to get it to the inspector. Just the process. I needed to understand that. Thank you.
Yeah. So the recommendation asks you to give me delegated authority to prepare those boundaries and consult on them without the need for them to come back to the working party.
Okay.
As I say, I think this is a bit of a two-stage process. We identify what we think are sensible boundaries, and we consult on them and see what sort of response we're going to get. And I think that's something which the officer team can do on your behalf without bringing those three settlements back for any sort of detailed scrutiny by the working party. Because we'll follow the same methodology. If you were to start to sort of pick those lines apart and start moving them around, well, then clearly that would undermine the methodology we've used, and we'd have to revisit other settlements. Angie's point that she made about the garden centre being included might well relate to other settlements elsewhere where similar decisions have been made. And if we start redrawing one and changing the approach that we've taken, you've got to adopt the same approach elsewhere and review all of the others as well. So I'm really saying I think we've done a sensible job. We'll do the same with the other three settlements and get on and consult on them and see what people have got to say.
Sorry, just can you remind me the names of them to make sure that we've got them in the appendix, so that when
I might look for Pauline to remind me here. So it's C. Pauling,
Walcott and Potter.
C. Pauling, Walcott and Potter
Okay.
Hire.
Okay. Yeah, they are in the list. That's right. Sorry, I just wanted to check that we've got that right, so that the process.
And anything we need to include on Corpusty would be added in there as well.
No, that's fine. They're in there, so that's great. Thank you, Mark. No, that's answered everything. Thank you.
Councillor Rest, if you'd like to come in.
Oh, thank you very much, Chairman, for letting me speak. Just a quick question, Mark. In reviewing these boundary changes, is this going to open up for previous developers who've had their permissions refused by looking at the boundary, and if they think that now they're right next door to it, or it's been moved in their favour, are we likely to see a return of some of the refused plannings before? The one I have in mind is the rather large one that was going to be done in Sculthorpe.
Yeah, okay. Right. So two things to bear in mind here. This approach is only allowed for in the growth villages, and it is subject to limitations in policy SD3, which talk about the scale of development. So it will not open up large scale development opportunities around the towns and villages. There's a size limitation. It's only in the growth villages, not elsewhere. And there's a caveat in the policy which only allows for each of those villages to grow by no more than 6% in terms of housing numbers on top of what currently exists today. So we will be monitoring the number of completions in those villages and only releasing land up to this 6% sort of threshold. Now, I don't want to reopen the debate about the policy itself here, because we've already agreed the policy about a year or so ago, and this is really about defining lines on a plan. But I will say it is clearly a significant shift in policy approach, and we are deliberately opening up development opportunities around the selected settlements And the way it works, because of this 6% threshold, it's almost an incentive. It's first come, first served. You know, if you get your planning permission and you secure permission for the development that is built, that will use up the sort of 6% allowance and deny others the opportunity. All of these sites, John, whether they're inside or outside, will have to meet all the other criteria about design and their impact and, you know, landscape considerations, highway considerations, amenity considerations. So the opportunities are there, but they're modest. And in order to comply, you have to be adjacent to the boundary, not detached from. So this is not opening up, you know, remote sites or distant sites a long way away from the settlements. It's opening up what I would describe as rounding off and infill opportunities, the sort of sites that members over the years have referred to and gone and visited and have perhaps been inclined to support, but have been told you're outside the boundary in the countryside, this is contrary to policy. And, you know, not large numbers, but over the years there's been some frustration, I think, that boundary line operates in such a definitive, you know, black and white way and doesn't give you the opportunity to release some sites which you think are obvious. It clearly creates the risk that what we think is less obvious might appear to be very obvious to a developer. And we will get applications on sites that we're perhaps not prepared to support, and the case will need to be made as to whether it complies or doesn't comply with this policy approach. We can't have it both ways. We can't have a definitive line on a plan and more flexibility. If we want more flexibility, what comes with that is a degree of risk that will be faced with some sites that we're not entirely comfortable with. And it will be up to the development committee to say we're not comfortable with this site and we think we've got decent refusal reasons. And notwithstanding this policy, which allows for a bit of rounding off, this bit of rounding off is unacceptable for this particular reason and we're going to refuse it. You know, to say, with increased flexibility, there's a bit more risk and it's a little bit more difficult to make decisions because you don't have the comfort of a black and white approach that says yes or no. But Sculthorpe can't come back under this approach. It's far too big. And Sculthorpe is not one of the selected settlements, I don't think.
Councillor Grove-Jones, would you like to come in at this point?
Just a quickie, Mark. As you are aware, Catfield is always contentious. I have no end of problems with them. They're so small, but they're so flipping argumentative. And I can see some problems with this when it goes before them, because they are still mithering on about changing the industrial area to basically quite a large section for residential. Would they be arguing that here? I don't think they'll argue everything that goes before them, but have you anything to say on that one?
Yeah, so I've spoken to Catfield. They're broadly content with the approach that's being recommended here, and they understand the consequences of it. They do have some particularly strong views about the development potential of the former, is it a mushroom farm or was it a duck farm? It was a duck farm, wasn't it? I think, site, to the fact that it's a derelict sort of approach into the village. They'd like to see that redeveloped. The issue there is that's designated and will continue to be designated as employment land. So the policy context says this should be employment development. The parish seem to be persuaded that there's a good case for residential on that site. As I say, the key policy hurdle there is it's designated for employment land, and this approach won't change that. It'll remain as employment land in the new plan.
That's a pity, actually, because it's been that way for the last 30 years and it's been derelict. It is the old mushroom farm. Half has been developed and this half has stayed. But there we are. I mean, if that's what... Is there no way...
I think the case has got to be made in the normal way, Pauline. There are two schools of thought here. You know, Nigel might say something about this in a minute. You know, the designated employment land status and its ability to be brought to the market has been largely untested. We're not aware that it's been tested for employment development. You had similar issues on a piece of land in Stalham, which we argued a long time with Hopkins Homes on. I think it's for the applicant, and there is some interest in residential development, to make that case and argue with the development committee about the benefits of redevelopment versus the loss of the employment land in the context of any evidence that's put forward in relation to marketing and demand for employment land locally. I think, to be frank, Pauline, the working party shouldn't be involved in that. It's not for us. It's a development committee decision in the event that a planning application is made. Where we're drawing the lines for Catfield won't alter that policy debate. It'll still be about, are we happy to lose the employment land potential in order to secure what might be a significant improvement to the appearance of the site and the approach into the village. But that's for the development committee.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Even when a planning application is made.
Right. Well, you'll be very unlucky to get a decent planning application out of them, I have to say, at this particular point in time. But I agree. I mean, Nigel and I have had so many discussions about this with regard to the necessity for employment land, the necessity for small industrial commercial sites versus the growing demand for residential. And this one in Catfield, as Nigel knows it as well as I, is a blight. But to what we do with it, I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much for that.
Any further questions or comments before we move to the recommendation and the vote? Councillor Dixon, do you want to come in one final time?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just noticed on page 44 in relation to Horning, I assume it's a typo, but you've got reference to Tunstead Road in describing where that settlement is. My understanding is that isn't Tunstead Road, but it's some other road, but it's not Tunstead Road.
Thank you. We'll check it before we publish, Nigel. Thank you.
Right. So the recommendation. Sorry.
I was just going to say, so the recommendation in the report is that you accept the proposed boundaries as shown in the attached appendix, recommend those through for Cabinet for consultation at Reg 19 stage.
And the second part is delegate authority to yourself for the settlement boundaries, in particular for Seapauling, Walcott and Potter Heigham, using the same methodology. I think that's
Please.
right.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a sort of a double recommendation in a way. Emma, if we move to, I propose, I'm getting ahead of myself. I propose that we recommend this for consultation. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Grove-Jones. Thank you very much. And now over to you, Emma, to call out names so that we can vote for, against, or to abstain.
Thank you, Chairman. I will call your names out alphabetically, members. So starting with Councillor Adams.
For.
Councillor Brown.
For.
Councillor Dixon.
For.
Councillor Fisher.
For.
Councillor Fitch-Tillett.
For.
Councillor Gay.
For.
Councillor Grove-Jones.
For.
Councillor Heinrich.
For.
Councillor Mancini-Boyle.
For.
Councillor Pearce.
For.
And Councillor Toy.
For.
That's unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you, members, for that. So we move to agenda item 8, pages 73 to 94. The local plan open land area designation for wells next to the sea. I hope members have had a chance to look at the at the report and the photographs. I think there's just one perhaps typographical error at the heading of page 93, which I think should be 22 rather than 21. Otherwise, we've got two sites with a number 21 appended to them. So I'm sure that will be corrected. And I believe it's back to you, Mr. Ashwell, to lead us through this.
Okay, so I'm going to do a relatively short sort of little update and presentation. So at the last stage of consultation on the local plan, we also published details separately in one of the background papers about what are called open land area designations, otherwise largely known as public open space, but they incorporate lots of sites inside of the development boundaries of settlements, like formal recreation grounds, playing fields. Some of them are used for car parks, some of them are village halls with adjacent green areas, but they are all sort of largely recognised as important pieces of the key things. They are green open spaces, largely without built development on them. A good example of one would be the green field opposite the Co-op store in Wells, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's not public open space. There's no public access to it. There's no fixed equipment on it. You can't go and kick a football around. It's privately owned, has livestock on it. But it is nevertheless designated as one of our green open spaces because the fact that it is open and undeveloped brings value and character to that part of the settlement. So the underlying policy that goes with these green open spaces is one which generally restricts development opportunities. It prevents the erection of buildings other than things like on sports pitches. We obviously allow sort of changing rooms and ancillary sort of structures associated with the use of a sports pitch for sporting purposes. So there's a lot of these spaces all around the district. We published a document with them all in, and largely they were uncontested. Parish councils and town councils nominated a few additional areas which were added in. And then as part of the local plan consultation, we had some additional representation, specifically these concerning 3 potential candidate new areas, all located along Wells Quayside. The appendix document's got some photographs in. So I think from page 80-ish onwards, there are photographs of these 3 potential candidate sites. They've all gone again through a sort of appraisal process, which we've applied to all of the sites across the entire district, looking at things like size, openness, whether they're green or not, the contribution they make to character. And we've come to a judgment as to whether they should qualify or not. You'll see the recommendation in the report is that of the 3 spaces put forward, only 1, which is an area currently leased to Wells Yacht Club, located on that far end of East Quay. We think that does meet the criteria. It's quite a significant green space. It's free of buildings at the moment. It's publicly accessible. We think that meets the qualifying criteria. The other 2, we don't. You'll see, and I think you've all had copies of representations from Mr. Terrington, where he argues for designation of the 3 spaces, although I think perhaps accepts that the 2 that we're not recommending perhaps don't qualify for open space designation, but nevertheless ask the council to consider other controlling mechanisms, refers to possible designation as Article 4 directions, which would have the effect of limiting development potential for specific types of development proposals in these locations. So I'm not going to go through the merits of each individual space that's included in the report. I'm going to recommend that one of the 3 is designated. And I'm going to say that in relation to the Article 4 direction possibilities, that's not an issue for local plan preparation. So Article 4s can be served whether you're preparing a local plan or not. They are a separate tool that local authorities can use. They don't need to be introduced when we're preparing a local plan. They could be introduced at any time. So I don't think it's appropriate to look at that in terms of local plan preparation. If members thought there was some merit in Article 4 directions, then we would want to bring back a separate detailed report about what Article 4 directions are, what you can do with them, what are the consequences of serving. So I would discourage you from going down that route at the moment. But I would say that of the 2 candidate sites that we're not recommending for inclusion, they are both in the AONB, they're both in the conservation area, and they are both in high risk flood areas. So the development potential on those parcels of land is extremely limited anyway. I mean, there's some potential, but they're already subject to a lot of constraining policies. And I'm not personally persuaded by the need for any further policy approaches to limit development potential in those 2 other locations. So the recommendation is that we just designate one of the 3 spaces as an additional open land area. I'm finished there, Chair, unless there are any questions.
Thank you very much. I have no questions. Can I throw it open to the floor? Does Councillor Fisher have anything he wishes to raise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did speak to the clerk about these sites, and he was content with the site opposite the sailing club going forward. Of the other 2, he didn't think there was a problem.
Thank you. Anyone else? I don't see any hands raised at the moment. Councillor Grove-Jones?
Because
Right,
I'm being particularly thick, is this site photos the last one which you mentioned, Andrew? They've got 2 of WEL21. Is it the last set of photos, Mark?
Yeah.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Uh,
See a problem. I can't see a problem.
okay, thank you very much. Councillor Gay, would you like to come in?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not dissenting from the recommendation here, but I'd just like to say I think it would be good if we looked more carefully at Article 4 direction at some point in the future. I think it might be helpful. It's often been discussed, but I don't think there's ever been a paper about it. Thank you.
Yeah, it does raise the interesting question about how Article 4 directions are, as it were, determined. Could you just give us a little bit of background to that, Mark?
Yeah, so I think maybe not the working party, but possibly the development committee may have looked at the issue of Article 4 directions in relation to the pastures at Blakeney relatively recently. You'll remember there was a lot of controversy about fences which were being erected and the enclosure of a parcel of land. Reluctant to give myself any additional work, but I think it's an interesting area that the working party might want to ask me to do a short paper on by way of explanation about how that particular tool can work and how it can complement other things we're doing. But it's quite a technical area. It comes with potential compensation claims from people who are disadvantaged. There are quite a lot of regulatory provisions to follow. You can't just serve these Article 4s if you want to. But essentially what they do is they remove or introduce the need for planning permission for things that would normally be able to be done without planning consent. So they are a tool to remove permitted development rights. So if your thing requires planning permission anyway, Article 4s have no impact whatsoever. You just need to make a planning application. So they're only really a useful tool for those things, as I say, which are permitted development, where you want to introduce control via the need for that person to make a planning application. And they are usually targeted to very specific types of permitted development. So you would serve for perhaps an Article 4 direction to remove the right to put up a boundary fence in a front garden. You know, the type of development you are targeting would be mentioned in the Article 4. We have Article 4 directions in the district in relation to the use of land for caravan sites. We have some relating to replacement windows in some buildings. So they are very, very targeted, specific measures aimed at controlling particular types of development proposal. They are not very good for just introducing blanket controls. You know, conservation areas introduce a blanket control over a wide array of different development types. Article 4 directions are targeted at very specific types of development that you would like to control, where at the moment you don't have any controls because they are permitted development. But it's, as I say, a short paper and a discussion. If you find that helpful, I'm about to volunteer myself to do that for perhaps not the next working party, but maybe one a little bit further down the tracks. And I was going to say, I noticed Mr. Terrington's online. I imagine he's listening. He didn't take the opportunity to speak. I'll write to him after the working party meeting and explain the rationale behind today's decision and continue the discussion about Article 4 directions with him. And maybe that example might be one that I can reference in a future report, but I shall write to him after the meeting.
Thank you for offering to do that. That would be very beneficial, I think, for Mr. Terrington. Councillor Grove-Jones.
Mark, I guess I'm slightly confused here as ever. Covenants. Now, I know that we have had covenants on the housing development at Millside, Rivermead and Heron Gardens, which were introduced in the mid-70s and have now seemed to have run a course. Are they limited in time factor? Because I mean, most of it's concerned with enclosing gardens, which were supposed to be open plan, and people have come along and put up hedges and walls, etc. And it's caused a lot of minor aggravation. I don't know whether covenants are limited or not, or whether they are just superfluous.
Okay, so first thing to say is covenants have nothing to do with the planning department. So they're entirely separate legal mechanisms. They're not imposed by local authorities other than via our own sale of land through property services. We might well impose covenants there, but they're separate legal controls. Some are time limited. They cover all sorts of things. They can limit buildings on sites and your opportunity to do all sorts of things via a legal restriction. They only really have force if they're enforced by the person who put the covenant on in the first place. So quite often over time, they tend to lapse. The person who had an interest in putting the covenant on perhaps moved on doing different things. A lot of house builders, for example, put covenants on that you can't put a caravan on your front drive. Whilst they're selling properties on that estate, they don't want people putting caravans on the front drive. Once they've moved away, people start putting caravans on their front drive. They've got no interest in enforcing that covenant because the covenant's in their name. They're the only people with enforcement powers. It's not for anybody else to enforce it. It's for the person who put the covenant on in the first place. Quite often there are covenants which overlap with planning controls. So you'll know in the past it was commonplace on housing estates to remove permitted development rights for front boundary walls. That's a planning control. It's a breach of condition to put a boundary wall up. That may have also been reflected in a parallel covenant that was also there as well. Again, with covenants, they're only as good as the people who are enforcing them. We wouldn't run around every town looking for front boundary walls, looking to take enforcement action. What we would do is respond to complaints from neighbours and others that unauthorised work had gone on and seek to impose controls through enforcing the conditions. So they're reactive rather than proactive tools that we have available to us, but entirely separate. Covenants is a legal restriction. Planning conditions are with us.
Thanks for that, Mark. That's really helpful. You're absolutely right. the covenants were put on by the original builder of the estate here. They have since lapsed. The only thing that still seems to be extant are the erection of fences which go above the planning definition of height. And again, that's something which is continually being challenged. Thanks for that. That was very helpful.
Right. Yeah, just following on from that, I think most developers where you have a planning condition that or plans that have been submitted for approval for open boundaries on properties are reflected, the planning condition is reflected in covenants on the land to have that boundary remain open. So you get, there's an interplay of a set in some senses, but obviously restrictive covenants are entirely separate to the planning process. Anyone else would like to come in at this point? Gerard, Councillor Mancini Boy would like to come in.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've owned a couple of properties with covenants on them, and truthfully, you only ever get caught out when you sell the property or buy the property, depending on how good the solicitor is. If they're particularly keen, then you have a hell of a job trying to sell it or buy it, and that's pretty much the only time it ever comes into force.
Exactly so. Exactly so. Right. Anyone else at this point before we move to the recommendation? If you want to, no, I don't see anybody raising their hand. If you want to read the recommendation, Mark.
So the recommendation is that we designate that one additional area, East Quay, as open land area in the local plan. The only modification I saw, and it's probably not necessary, is whether you want to specifically resolve to ask me to give further advice on Article 4 directions or rely upon my good nature to bring back a report when I've got a little bit of time.
Well, I don't want to confuse this particular recommendation with the wider Article 4 directive picture. If we can leave it that you will diarise, as I'm sure you are very efficient in doing, to bring a paper to perhaps the next but one working party.
I'll put it on as a discussion item at an appropriate time when the working party agendas look otherwise light, when there's not so much business to get through. So it'll probably be a little bit of time coming because we've got, probably the next 3 or 4 meetings are going to be quite hectic. But I'll make a note and bring it back as either a discussion item or maybe a training item, Chair. We're trying to do something on training. It might be appropriate to do it outside of the working party and put it on a wider training event for members generally. Interesting area, and we could broaden it out to not just Article 4 directions, but maybe some of the other sort of novel controls that might be available that we periodically refer to, just to bring members up to speed. Sounds like a general update, including Article 4s, might be helpful.
Sounds like a good idea, Mark. I think.
I think there'll be widespread support for that. Make good use of the reserve days as well in the diary for those training sessions. And I think that's probably everything covered on that. Well, I propose that we make this recommendation as reported. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Fisher, very appropriately, being the local member. Thank you very much for that. If I can go to you, Emma, to institute the vote.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'll call out your names as previously members if you can just indicate whether you're voting for, against or abstaining. So starting with Councillor Adams.
For.
Councillor Brown.
For.
Councillor Dixon.
For.
Councillor Fisher.
For.
Councillor Fitch-Tillett.
For.
Councillor Gay.
For.
Councillor Grove-Jones.
4,
Councillor Heinrich,
4,
Councillor Mancini Boyle,
4,
Councillor Pearce,
4,
and Councillor Toy.
4.
And that is unanimous, Chairman.
thank you very much for that. We've no business under item 9. We've no reason to exclude the press or public. No exempt matters from public business, and which is item 11. Item 12, no exempt business from me either under item 4 above. So thank you very much for your attendance this morning. I feel that we are making very good progress with the local plan preparation. Unless there's anything else, Mark, that we need to mention at this stage before we wrap the meeting up, I think that's all we need to cover.
I didn't have any specific to raise, Chair. I will endorse your views about progress being made. I think the run up to Christmas, there were some quite big items on the agendas, which we got through. I know there were 1 or 2 long meetings, but I do feel that we've sort of turned a bit of a corner now in terms of making progress. There's still 2 or 3 knotty sort of policy areas. Particularly, probably this coming month, we'll get the housing target coming back. At the moment, we're waiting on the Gladman appeal at Holt, which will be informative about the sort of process that we should be going through around establishing the final housing target on the plan. So that'll probably come in February. And then we've just got 2 or 3 sort of policy areas to get through. And then we've dealt with this sort of phase of plan making and get on and draft the next version of the plan for consultation. So thank you for that.
Mark, when these small settlements go out for review, will you have the same situation where there will be the plans up in a public space for the public to view? I mean, God help you, but I mean,
I think it will depend on the COVID restrictions at the time, Pauline, and
of course, yes.
By perhaps June or July, things may be a little different, but I think currently the prospects of us holding public exhibitions are probably...
Yes, I completely forgot about that.
Even if we were able to put up static displays, the idea of encouraging people to go to venues, probably not going to happen. Largely speaking, at Regulation 19 stage, I know it's not something that members really support, but most authorities at Reg 19 stage do electronic sort of consultation. They make their documents available, via web pages and so on. I haven't started thinking about it yet, Pauline.
Okay.
But we'll obviously get the message out as widely as we can. We've got thousands of people now on a database that will get notified. Obviously, all of the parishes and town councils will be involved, as will all of the developer interest. Those that are interested at this stage are largely those people who made representations last time round. So we know of them and we know how to reach them. But we'll have to think carefully about how we do any broader consultation exercises, depending on the rules that apply at the time.
Well, I think you'll be lucky if there's any sort of real lightening of the situation, even up until September, October, November time. It looks as if we should be clamped down basically for this whole year.
Government has changed a lot of the underlying procedural regulations, both in the way that we deal with planning applications and prepare local plans, to allow for more flexibility around consultation events. So we're not going to get tripped up by a procedural requirement to do something that we can't do because of the COVID rules. They specifically modified the procedural regulations to allow for that flexibility, I think up until April next year. So quite a long way away.
Well, thank you, Mark, for your work and the work of your team. Very grateful to you. I think I can speak for all members. I see Councillor Toy applauding your efforts. I think I can speak for all members here in saying thank you for the work that you're doing. And I think on that, that close